Good morning everyone with Blood Group A. Good afternoon everyone with Blood Group B, and also good evening to the special Blood Group O havers. Today is Sunday, we are in the weekend, and we have something very interesting to talk about, something that we forgot existed because we were too busy talking about the news of Dragonflight and all of the different things, different features, activities and tasks you have to do for your first week, etc, etc. We forgot Blizzard exists, we forgot Blizzard takes care of specs and classes and whatnot, and what we have for today is balance tuning to talk about. Now, it is disappointing. I am going to stop you right here in case you start revving up your Hopium tanks that there is going to be some massive overhaul of specs and classes. No, there isn't, but we do have some changes for today. The first change we have to talk about is an overall buff for the entire role. We are talking about tanks. Tanks are getting their threat increased from 550% threat increase generated by their abilities to 650% threat increase generation. So Blizzard perhaps is already foreseeing Mythic Plus pulls and item level increase, giving DPSers even more damage than they already can do in Mythic Zeros in very low item level. So they are getting ahead of time and trying to get tanks to have a little bit of an easier time keeping aggro in dungeons in particular. So this is okay. We have gotten this pretty much every expansion, Blizzard fine-tuning the amount of threat tanks generate to sort of stay even with the threat that DPSers produce. So that is okay. It's expected. It shouldn't really be a problem in a dungeon. You should not also add the whole mechanic of keeping aggro on your tank. This is not 2007, so that's cool. As for the actual specs and the particular changes to each spec, we have to start with the nerf to Demon Hunter. There is some collateral damage here because the first nerf is the damage done by the hand nerfed by 10%, and the hand is a general talent tree ability, which means it's also gonna hit Vengeance Demon Hunter, not just Havoc. The bigger nerf is to Fodder to the Flame, which previously also scaled with haste, and now Fodder to the Flame is gonna have its own fixed cooldown without scaling with the haste of Havoc. This has been a problem before, Havoc having multiple things from trinkets to corruptions scaling with haste, Havoc having quite a few ways to speed up their haste in their talents, they used to have at least, and then they also had their own stats, their own secondary stats they were stacking in haste to make many of their things scale with haste, and Fodder to the Flame was too. Now this talent will be much less powerful because it won't be reduced in the time it takes for it to proc by the haste of the Demon Hunter. They were first nerfed with Any Means Necessary, which went to hit their mastery, and then they were nerfed in Know Your Enemy, which went to hit their crit, and now they were nerfed in Fodder to the Flame, which went to hit their haste. So pretty much an overall across the board hit to the scaling of Havoc Demon Hunter's secondary stats. As for Druid, we have one nerf. No, Feral Druids, if you were hoping at some time in the spotlight since you're doing quite well nowadays, it's not hitting you. Guardians, also don't fear, even after your Giga buff in damage, you're not getting nerfed. Balance Druids, of course, you were already doing not too well anyways, so why nerf Balance? The nerf goes to Restoration Druid, and specifically just to the Resto spec to Regrowth. I'm saying specifically just to the Resto spec because Regrowth is available to all the other specs. So the Regrowth healing reduction just goes to Resto Druid, reduced by 6%. We're not talking about a big nerf, also Regrowth is not the main source of healing for a Resto Druid, but it is still something. It is still perhaps a message, a sign that Blizzard is looking at the current power level of Resto Druid and trying to tone it down a little bit. Surprisingly, it's the only healer that gets nerfed in this round of changes from Blizzard. We move away from Druid and we just jump into Hunter. Now, you might have noticed that the problems with Hunter reside primarily with marksmanship and with survival. Beast Mastery is doing fine. They are not OP, they're not super strong, but they are not complaining. Marksmanship and survival, however, are quite in the dumpster, to use a technical term. So, what are the changes to Hunter? First, we have some general changes to the General Tree, which means also indirectly it's going to be a buff to Beast Mastery as well, not just to the other two Hunter specs. One is Steel Trap, damage increased by 20%, then you have Explosive Shot, damage increased by 15%, and then Barrage, damage increased by 15%. None of this is part of your general rotation, one of your main ways to do damage, so It's a general help, but the more particular, the more targeted help goes to marksmanship, where all of the damage of marksmanship is increased by 10%, and the other buff where heavy ammo now causes trick shots to ricochet for an additional 25% of your damage instead of 10%. So a significant improvement in the health of your AoE damage, which was quite weak and continues to be quite weak after you lost Wild Spirits and you lost your wide AoE damage. Now you are much more hard capped than before, and you're still on the weaker side when it comes to your AoE damage nowadays. For survival, the buff is smaller. The damage buff is a flat 5% damage increase to all of the abilities of survival. Now, unfortunately, this is where we might get a little bit disappointed, where some players might get a little bit triggered even, so I will put a trigger warning before I mention this. The mention I have to have is about mages. So we are in an incredible moment in time where the two better specs for a mage are Frost and Arcane. That's right. To be fair, Frost is doing quite better than Arcane, but still, if we had to pick two of the mage specs that are doing better, miraculously, Mage as Fire would not be part of it. That's where the trigger warning comes in, because Fire Mage is getting buffed. This is the contract that Blizzard stipulated with Fire Mage. Fire Mage cannot go 1 month without receiving buffs if they are seen as too weak. So this is what they get. Flame Strike damage is increased by 8%, Pyro damage by 5%, Fireball by 10%, together with Scorch, and then Ignite damage, which was nerfed just a couple of weeks ago, also got buffed by 5%. So basically all of the 4 generally used abilities of Mage are buffed, plus the actual passive main damage source of Mage, Ignite, gets buffed as well. As I said, this is a mandatory change. Blizzard is forced contractually to keep buffing Fire until they become relevant again. So I am afraid we might not see in the end Fire Mage not being played in the end if Blizzard keeps buffing them until they become meta again. I don't think this is enough. This is quite enough to bring them there, but it's a step in the right direction for Fire and the wrong direction for everyone else. After Fire Mage and the Mage in general, we have Rogues. Now, this change to Rogue is very interesting because it reads like this. Exsanguinate cooldown has been increased to 3 minutes instead of 45 seconds, and the bleed effect magnitude, the increase in the speed in which they tick, has been reduced from 100% faster increase to 80% faster increase. Now, this is a ridiculous nerf. It's nerfed by over 3 times its cooldown. It's as if someone took your Avenging Rat, took the 2-minute cooldown and turned it into a 6-minute cooldown. So, the Blizzard explanation is that out of nowhere, after 3 months of the beta and testing the Assassination talents, Blizzard discovers that Exsanguinate is broken and they don't quite know how to balance it at the moment with the release of the season so close. So their answer is, we are temporarily making it unplayable and unusable until we find out exactly what can we do about it. You might say it is perhaps worthwhile in the sense that Assassination was one of the better looking specs when it came to the raid and when it came to single target damage, and this can net out to be a 6 to 7% nerf in single target for Assassination, so it's quite relevant, it's quite significant overall. I don't think, however, it makes sense if you consider, for example, the current strength of Outlaw, which beats Assassination pretty much across the board. Yet the mega nerf goes to Assassination in the meantime, hoping that Blizzard finds a solution to this supposedly exsanguinate problem quite soon. After dealing with Rogue, we have Monk. The first change is to Brewmaster, which is not one of the premier tanks at the moment, and therefore they receive a buff. Brewmaster's balance now grants you 45% increased stamina instead of 30%. So Brewmaster on its own in a dungeon group is quite squishy. It's one of the tankiest tanks when it comes to taking less damage if you have the support of multiple healers, which can heal you slowly with HOTS, with support heals. They take quite little damage. Their problem is when they are in a dungeon, when there is only one healer and they drop quite low and they have very few ways to bring themselves back up, like other tanks can, like Blood Death Knight, for example, Vengeance Demon Hunter, for example. Brewmaster has that kind of problem. This change gives them more HP, makes them take more time to drop lower because their stamina now, their health pool is now larger, it's wider. So that's a buff for Brewmaster. Mistweaver also gets buffed. Awakened Feline Spinning Crane Kicks now heals 3 nearby allies for 60% of the damage dealt instead of 50%. Vivify also heals the primary target for 20% more. Peaceful Mending now increases the healing received by Enveloping Mist by 15 to 30% instead of 10 to 20%. Yu'lon's Whisper now heals 5 targets instead of 6, but the healing is increased by 15%. So it's better in group content. You take away 1 target because the 6th target doesn't exist in a dungeon content. In return, you get more healing. So again, also perhaps needed buff to Mistweaver, although these are not the kind of buffs that are needed for Mistweaver, but we would have to spend an entire video talking about it. So let's just leave it at that for now and mention that Mistweaver has been buffed in their healing. Now, on to the next spec getting changed. This one is for Protection Paladin, which is also another one of the tanks not having too good of a time at the moment, at the very least as the predicted popular tanks for the first season of Dragonflight. Edges of Light now grants 50% increased stamina instead of 45% and 30% increased armor instead of 15%. Once again, that was the other one of the squishier of tanks. Together with Brewmaster, Protection Paladin was also kind of made of paper, so this one is a slight increase in stamina and a larger increase in the armor they have. So more durability buffs to Protection Paladin. We move to Shaman now, and the bigger problems for Shaman were on Elemental and Restoration. Enhancement is having quite the good time at the moment. Unfortunately, Elemental gets ditched in this round of tuning. The only one that gets targeted is Restoration Shaman. So the first one is the buff to their healing. All their healing spells are increased by 5%. This is a band-aid. This is a tiny band-aid. The problems of Shaman as Resto are bigger than this, and 5% is definitely not enough to suddenly turn them into a meta spec. The other problem also gets addressed, because not only do they have problems in overall healing in a raid environment, they also have problems in the damage they can do in a Mythic Plus environment. So the buff is to Acid Rain, the talent to turn your healing rain to also do damage to enemies. Now the damage has been buffed by 50%. This is a more significant help. It's the best type of damage you want to do in Mythic Plus as a healer. Things you drop on the ground and you let them do damage by themselves, so you have time to heal. And you don't have to spend global cooldowns and time spamming things, for example, like Chain Lightning. This is quite good as a change for Shaman to help them with their Mythic Plus damage. Still too low and still has other problems, but this is a buff in the right direction. You would rather see this type of buff rather than seeing yet another buff to the damage of Chain Lightning or to the damage of Flame Shock or Lava Burst as a Resto Shaman. Very tiny, almost skippable. I only mention it because this is a further nerf to the survivability of Warlock, because now Soul Leech has been made even weaker. Now Soul Leech converts 3% of the damage dealt into an Absorb Shield from 6%. This is further nerf to the tankiness of Warlocks. That's why it's still worth mentioning. Lastly, we have Warrior. So if we had to mention one of the 2 DPS specs having a little bit of a worse time at the moment was Arms. So Arms is the one that gets targeted, although a minor one, because Fueled by Violence now heals you for 85% of the damage done by deep wounds instead of 65%. So the actual buff isn't even a damage buff. It's a self-sustain kind of buff. Not perhaps what Arms Warriors wanted to see. However, we have the nerf. We have the nerf I had pointed out and cried for weeks actually, which is the nerf to Brutal Vitality. This is what I said Warriors should have hoped happened 2, 3 or 4 weeks still into the beta. Because what you don't want to see is choosing your main as a Prot Warrior because it's OP and then get your strongest talent in the game for yourself nerfed right into the first week of the expansion. What do we get? Brutal Vitality now causes 15% of the damage you deal to add to your active Ignore Pain instead of 30%. I told you all. I said back in the day, I said you should be very happy if Blizzard stops at 20%. I think it's gonna have to be seen if Blizzard lowers it down to 15%, it's gonna be sketchy. If they go at or below 10%, then you're dead. We will have to see just how much the 15%, basically half of the effectiveness of this talent now with this nerf, how much is it going to impact Prot Warrior? They are 100% no longer the meta choice though. Vengeance was already tied with them. Even Guardian Druid wasn't doing that bad either. So now with this nerf, protection is losing quite a bit. We will have to reassess before the release of the season and see exactly just how bad it was hurt. But overall, at the end of this round of balance tuning, this was definitely the worst out of all of the changes in terms of nerfs. The one to Protection Warrior, easily shaking up things the most when it comes to the meta for the upcoming season. So waiting, now that we see Blizzard is still busy applying more tuning before the start of the season, waiting for more changes, we can now leave each other for today on this Sunday. Of course, as usual, I am thanking all of my Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help in growing myself and this channel. You can still, however, if you don't want to take money from your favorite e-girl fund, you can still support by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, which are still free ways to support. Then you can also find me on Twitter to follow. You can support me still on Patreon to get access to my Discord server as well. And nowadays I am also found streaming on Twitch as well, generally starting to stream past 10 p.m. in European times, 1 p.m. Pacific US times, and then 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. Now, with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I told you it would have been better to get these big nerfs before the release of the expansion, because now, tough luck, my friends.